Welcome to another episode of One-on-One with Mitch Lafon. I'm your host, Mitch Lafon. Joining me this week is special guest Steve Hackett, guitarist of Genesis, or formerly of Genesis. He's got a new tour called Extended, Genesis Extended, 2014 and 15 World Tour. And of course, a new album, Genesis Revisited, live at the Royal Albert Hall. And joining me to discuss Steve is my Metal Raps co-host, Mitch Joel. And of course, Mitch, your CV and job description is much more than just Metal Raps co-host. So why don't we let the folks know what else you do?
It'd be lovely if one day I could just do that for a living. No, I'm just kidding. I spent well over a decade in the metal scene writing for a whole bunch of publications during the late 80s and 90s and 2000s. Also published rock magazines, had a record label called Distort that signed Alexis on Fire and City in Color. And currently I just really do digital marketing at an agency called Twist Image that keeps me extremely busy.
Yeah, I can imagine. And of course, Metal Raps is one day going to take over the world, right?
If we do it well.
If we do it well enough. Yeah, so, Steve Hackett, one of the world's best-known guitarists, great guitarist. What's your opinion of Steve?
So Steve is an interesting character. I have to admit that my real introduction to him in terms of sort of live and in real life was actually with the supergroup GTR,
right,
which happened probably in the mid-'80s. I'm going to say like 85, 86. And most people remember the band for the song When the Heart Rules the Mind, which was a great tune, but it had a ton of other great songs like The Hunter. And it was just a very, very progressive sound at a time when I didn't think supergroups were sort of doing that sort of thing. And obviously tracking backwards, I realized, wow, this is the guy who was one of the sort of founding songwriters and musicians, obviously, in Genesis. And if you look at his history in Genesis, it really is fascinating, right? You can go back to 1971. I think his first recording with the band was Nursery Crime, which many people cite as sort of like one of the earlier stages and introductions of progressive rock. Yeah. He played on some of their most amazing albums, right? 1972's Foxtrot. He was involved in Selling England by the Pound. And he was actually there. I think he was involved in 74 for The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, which was a pretty seminal album too. So you sort of have this interesting phase where he was there for the Peter Gabriel era, and he was there right at the beginning when Phil Collins took over. And Phil Collins even was involved in some of his solo recording. People don't know this, but I think he was the first member of Genesis to actually even record a solo album. Yep. And then since then, he sort of has come out and been, one of the leading progressive rock guitarists of our time, and inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame through Genesis, of course, but has been prolific. I mean, he really is a prolific musician, whether he's touring, recording, or out there. Just an amazing guitarist, a guy who you can definitely know his sound and stylings for sure.
Oh, yeah, and he covers every kind of musical style. He's done, of course, the progressive stuff. He's done classical, blues, just all over the place. And, of course, there's a new Genesis documentary called Together and Apart, which he plays a small little role in. And, of course, he's very critical of the new documentary that just came out. So,
but it's hard with Genesis, too, right? Like when most people think of Genesis, it is one of those weird things where there are the two camps. There's the early Genesis, the Peter Gabriel, the sort of beginning of progressive rock. And then there's a sort of more pop culture sort of Phil Collins-y 80s Land of Confusion, Abacab, and that whole world. What's interesting about Hackett that he's not always sort of acknowledged for is not just the styles he plays, but his technique. So this guy was doing the finger tapping thing long before our buddy EVH, Eddie Van Halen, was doing it. He was doing it, granted, with a lot less distortion and a lot less flamboyance probably, but he really is one of these guys that is a sort of technical machine in terms of musicianship when it comes to guitar playing.
Yeah, and of course, back then, being flashy wasn't part of the scene. You weren't supposed to be the guy, the center spotlight. So perhaps had he come out in the mid-'80s, we would have had a flashy Steve Hackett. But listen, he does what he does. And of course, he's coming to Montreal in November, and the tour is going to be all over Quebec and all over Ontario. Why don't we just have a listen to Steve, because all of those things that you mentioned, his first solo album we talk about, working with Phil Collins we talk about, the documentary, and all those different styles. Let's have a listen to my interview with Steve Hackett. Good day. We are talking with Steve Hackett. Hey, Steve. How are you?
I'm doing very well, thank you. Very good.
So Steve, the one thing as an interviewer when you have a subject on the phone or you're talking to them is it's easy to come up with questions because usually careers last 5-10 years. With you, there's so much to cover that there really is no good point to start, and there's going to be no good point to finish. So I guess we'll just talk Genesis Revisited 2 at the beginning, and then we'll see. Because regardless of what I ask you, somebody's going to say, well, you didn't ask him this. You forgot that. So Genesis Revisited 2. You've been out of the band for, almost 40 years? Almost 40 years.
Yeah, since 77.
Yeah.
That's right.
What compelled you to go back for a second time, because you did this in 96 as well, what compelled you to go back and have another kick at the can, at the Genesis can? Why are we revisiting Genesis?
Well, to be honest, I wanted to do a show of the music that I wrote with Genesis back in the 70s. Right. There's been a tremendous amount of interest in it in recent years, as I'm sure you're aware. There have been a tremendous amount of tributes to it. Mm-hmm. But it can't escape everyone's notice the fact that there is no band actually prepared to go out there and do it. There might be 50-odd tribute bands out there, and maybe more at this point in time. I mean, there's masses of them, throughout Italy alone, for instance, mm-hmm. and the UK. There's a phenomenal amount, not to mention the French-Canadian connection and all of that. So I wanted to do a show. And the best way to reacquaint myself with music and everyone else who was going to be part of the touring band was to re-record it, if only to break down the parts to understand what they were, and some of them are quite complicated when you've got 3 12 strings all playing something slightly different but sympathetic. So there's a certain amount of analysis. Plus, I felt that I wanted to do expanded versions of the originals, try and get them both in tune and in time, but to take it further and use orchestra on some pieces and use an expanded lineup in every sense of the word. So we had 30 to 40 different people taking part in that. Now, some singers would say to you, to follow Phil Collins and Peter Gabriel, that's a tough act to follow. Because they are held in great affection with fans doing this stuff. So I wanted to take the pressure off all of the various singers by saying, well, you'd only do a track. You would do, Neil Morse would do Return of the Giant Hogweed, for instance. So pressure off. For each singer, they all sound very different with their own interpretations of this well-known material. And I think that worked well. Obviously, there was a huge amount of friends I had involved in that, but it put me in touch with other people as well that I'd not worked with before, and it was really enjoyable. We worked like crazy for 8 months to finish the thing. It started out as a single album, and it turned into a double because I was just going to do my favorite songs, and then one of the guys from EMI at the time said to me, really you should be doing songs where guitar is crucial to the plot. And I said, well, that's a whole other album. So we made it a double album. That was the plan. Of course, since then, Universal took over EMI, and the corporate reshuffle took place. It's a bit like Hungry Mouths, isn't it? One company taking over another. But, they've stayed with it. And they really seem to enjoy it a lot. So, plus the whole resurgence of interest in Genesis, because there's been a couple of products recently, all of which are archival, of course. But so that's probably the reasons why I decided to do it and do it this way around.
Yeah, and let's talk about some of the recent goings on with Genesis. But first, What is it about Genesis music that has endured the test of time? Because, you see a lot of one-hit wonders, you see a lot of music that was big in the 80s or big in the 90s, and nobody cares about it now.
Yeah.
What do you think is about the music of Genesis that has endured so long?
I tell you what, when I do my shows, and sometimes there are a lot of different people who walk on and off that stage who might be available in any one particular locale, I always say that the music is the star of the show. So we know that Genesis threw up some stars. We know about that. But the music is the star of the show. And I think that's because there's a term that I started to hear the Hungarians use a while back, and they said, through composed. Something which is through composed. Maybe they mean thoroughly composed. But the writing was important to Genesis. In those early years, as a songwriters collective, the writing was it was tough and hard to get something through the committee very often. So it had to be good, and I think it's that idea of a young band trying very hard to please each other first of all, which eventually pleased a much wider public.
Was it difficult to get accepted back in those days doing that progressive music? I mean, we had just sort of finished the era of the Beatles and these 2.5-minute pop ditties. We were getting into precursor of disco, and of course there was Alice Cooper and the shock rock, and Kiss with the shock rock stuff.
Well, I think that like Alice Cooper, if there's any one thing that links it, it was the fact that obviously Alice was an extraordinary visual show, and the Genesis show, when Peter Gabriel was fronting the band, started to become comparably visual. Pyrotechnics and costumes and stories tended to rule. At times that could have the effect of sidelining the music.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you.
Yeah, you really have two schools of approach. Yeah.
Did that ever get frustrating? Because, you look at the progressive movement, and for the lack of a better word, they're considered to be musos, people that are very serious about what they're doing. It's cerebral. Yeah. And then you've got these costumes going on. You go, well, wait a minute. Are we doing Broadway or are we doing music? I mean, did you have the trouble with that?
I didn't have a problem with that. I was very aware in the early days that Pete was, to my mind, the prime shaker and mover, because he'd often turn up late to rehearsals, but it was because he was on the phone hustling. Pete, humanitarian and great inventor that he is also a great hustler. Right. And he would work those connections. And when it came to the live shows, when he started to introduce more and more costumes, he didn't ask for permission to do it, because he knew that he would run into problems with the competitive spirit of the band. He just did it. And the fact that he stood on one stage one day wearing a fox's head and his wife's red dress got us on the front page of the most powerful English paper at the time, which was Melody Maker. Suddenly, front page news. So, job done, basically. No one can argue with that level of success. Of course, what tended to happen was, rather like David Bowie, people would be reviewing Pete's performance in the press, and the band were regarded as little more than a pit orchestra, I suspect. So, obviously, there was this dichotomy, this schism, but one had to be a realist and say, well, he's the star of the show, but it gets the music heard. So you've got the best of two worlds. Sometimes those worlds were in opposition to each other, like with Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. Tons of theatrics going on, tons of visual images, whether you're watching the screens, the lead singer running around, or what's going on behind it is the music, the thing that people that people listened to, and the music was complex, and it wasn't simple, and the songs weren't short. So what are you going to do? You play to strengths.
Yeah, and I think ultimately with all these sort of bands that are known for having the visual, ultimately it does come down to music. I mean, you can certainly argue that Madonna is all show, but the songs still resonate. Same with Kiss, same with Alice Cooper. It really does come down to, if the song stunk, you can dress it up any way you want. It's not going to last. Speaking of not lasting, Together and Apart is of course, the coming together of Genesis and the tearing apart of Genesis. And it just had its premiere recently, beginning of the month. And you're quoted as saying, well, you're not quoted, it is said that you are just unhappy with it.
That's right.
What is the main problem with the documentary?
Let's put it this way. All I said was that I wouldn't be selling it from my web store, from my website, because it marginalized my input. In other words, I did 4 hours to camera, and there's about 4 seconds on screen. So I think also there are various other people who are not really mentioned on it. Ray Wilson isn't mentioned, as if history was rewritten by the Soviets. I mean, it's Bill Bruford is not mentioned, and I think that it centers very much on something which is a slice of the band, but it's not the whole story. It purported to tell the whole story. I approached it with some trepidation when I was first approached. So, there's this, and it's going to be premiered here and premiered there. But there were two things on offer. There was the idea of doing the documentary and also doing the album which has 37 tracks on it with all the hits of Genesis, plus 3 solo tracks from Pete, from Phil, from Mike, from Tony, and from me. So we all had our solo tracks on it. So very balanced, a broad sweep in a way with the album. Very happy with the album. I think that it's extremely representative. Of course, there is not any original material on it, so as it is, it is firmly archival. But it's in the top 10 here, as are 7 other Genesis albums that are in the top 30 over here in the rock charts. So, in a sense, it's job done on this side of the pond. But in terms of what the documentary did, there's been a huge outcry. There's been a letter to the Radio Times over here. There's been stuff in Rolling Stone about it. There's been stuff in the English press. There's been, I'm getting these emails every day, and it's been in the Daily Mail over here, the Guardian, as I say, Rolling Stone, which makes sense on your side of the water. So there have been a lot of fans who aren't particularly happy with it. So I didn't have editorial input. I asked for it, and I was refused, and I smelt a rat. So I'll say no more. Not very happy with it. It's not great. If you want something that's got a comprehensive history of the band, that is not it. It seems to be orientated towards a later incarnation of the band. So,
let me follow up with 2 questions on that. When you say the music's all archival and there's nothing new, I get a sense that you say that from a perspective of disappointment, that you sort of wished there had been something new. Is that the right understand? That maybe you had wished that the guys could have gotten together and done 1 song, 2 songs?
Certainly, certainly. But I was approached with the idea from Genesis management of doing something which with a comprehensive history of the band on record, plus the idea of the 5 of us getting an equal billing on that record. So I said, yeah, okay, fine, great. It represents everyone's solo career as well as, what the band did. So in a sense, I think that the album delivers much more of the theme, more comprehensively of Together and Apart, whereas I think the BBC documentary tended to marginalize or indeed expunge certain people.
Yeah. I can see that. So then let's ask you the obvious question then.
Sure.
If you feel that you've been sort of marginalized or minimalized, how do you define your importance to Genesis? Original fans will say, well, he's the sound, he's the guitarist. But how do you see your role in the band?
Well, when I first joined the band, this is a long time ago, we're talking 42 years ago, or do I mean 43 years ago, in fact 71, I can't do my maths.
Yeah.
My role with the band was to give it input as a writer, but also I felt that they needed someone who had an overview, who could see when things weren't working and could see how things could be improved. So when I first joined, I didn't imagine that I would be joining something which would become a world force. I joined a band who were doing the occasional free shows, the college circuit, and scratching around to do gigs.
Right.
I felt straight away that we needed to change our approach towards the presentation. We needed to have our own light show. We needed to have an expanded keyboard arsenal. We needed to be able to have a mellotron. We needed to have a synth. And I just worked on everyone like Chinese water torture, drip, 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 until I got my way. So I felt that Genesis needed to improve their presentation, our presentation. I thought that if they won't weather this from me, then I simply am not going to join the band. I didn't think there was anything to lose. So it comes under the heading of something I often say, you have to be unpopular to be popular. So I think I had to say the things that people found uncomfortable when they'd been with the band for a long time. I think that bands can orientate towards the lowest common denominator with each other. You stop trying to push for things other guys are going to resist. But then when new blood arrives, like myself and Phil Collins, we could say things that the guys who'd spent all those years together at school, might find uncomfortable, but needed to be said.
So outside of just being the guitarist, then, did you sort of take a role of being a production manager in a sense, where you said, hey, we got it?
I felt that we didn't use the word in those days, but I felt that I needed to mentor the band, if you like. I was the guy, when we did finally get our light show, and finally got our mellotron, I'd go and sit out front for rehearsals, and I wanted to watch it, and I wanted to see, with a long lead, so I could be part of the band, and also not part of it, see what it looked and sounded like. And I was really, really pleased in the days when we had ultraviolet lights, black light, and we had our own light shows, just 4 trees on the corners of the stage. But the band had a look, and it had a feel, and it was so different from the band that I saw doing a free Christmas lunchtime show, Christmas 1970, where I had misgivings. I thought, if I joined this, I could make it stronger. I don't want to sound egotistical here, because there's no ego involved with this.
Right.
If there's been another band, full of virtuosic music and great light show and really slick, I wouldn't be saying this, and I wouldn't have joined. But I thought, there's room for me here.
Let's be fair also about the ego. The question that I posed was meant to have you talk about yourself, so it's not ego. You're just answering the question. So
okay, all right.
Let's be fair about that.
I think that people think perhaps that bands come fully formed, but I think that gestation period that's all important of a band traveling from semi-professional outlook to professional is all important with the arc of any band's development. You think of the Beatles and the years that they spent, 6 years in the wilderness before they hit our screens. Whether that was Hamburg or scratching around, any dingy place that'll have them. And it's the same for every band. There has to be that baptism of fire, that rite of passage, perhaps.
Now, We're down to our last 10 minutes, and I knew that we're going to run out of time. I mean, we've got GTR, we got to circle back to the tour, but I want to ask you about your first solo album, Voyage of the Acolyte. So, especially back in those days, solo albums, in 75, in the 70s, generally meant you left the band. But you hadn't. But the other thing that's interesting about it is you went out to sort of forge your own way and have your own vision on an album, but you brought along Rutherford. You brought along Phil Collins. Why did you bring them along? Why didn't you just say, listen, I'm going to go do my own thing, and then lock yourself away in a room and do it?
Well, I think that it was very difficult often to get things through the five-man team, to get your ideas done. It's difficult enough with four guys. It's, when you've got five writers, no one is getting a huge chunk of the writing. You're having to share it. And I felt that in a way, Landmarks Down on Broadway was something that served perhaps the interests of Pete more than the rest of the band. Now, I think that I understand it, and I'm hugely sympathetic to Pete's position within the band at the time. It was complicated for him. There was a lot of competition, and I think guys in the band often unnecessarily stood in his way.
Right.
I think there was always an agenda to whittle the band down to as few members as possible.
Were there too many members?
Sorry?
Were there just too many members? Should Genesis just have been a three-piece?
Possibly too many members, but, it's two people who hold the band title at this point in time, but they're not actually doing anything with it.
Right.
Yes, I think that there were a lot of people. I had a lot of material that I'd amassed that I thought, I'm never going to get this through the band thing here. I wasn't that experienced at working with rhythm sections, which is why I asked Phil and Mike to do it. But I did want to work with other people like my brother. So it was his first professional album. It was the first time I worked with John Aycock, who was tremendous. First time I worked with various people, Johnny Gustafson, Robin Miller on oboe, Sally Oldfield, Mike Oldfield's sister, the occasional string player like Nigel Warren Green, and it was lovely to be able to work outside the auspices of the band and just have the music take precedence. Yeah,
absolutely. I'm just looking here. I'm looking at the time because I'm trying to figure out what question to ask next. 1977.
Sure, I know it's tricky.
It is.
Half hour. Yeah.
October 77. You quit the band. Have you ever looked back at that decision and said, bloody hell, what a mistake? Or have you always just been, no, that was the right thing, and 40 years later, or almost 40 years later, you go, no, that was still the right decision. End of story.
I always think it's the right decision because my theory is that music is its own currency. It repays you with something other than money.
Right.
Sometimes it pays the bills, and sometimes it doesn't. But the fact is, I cannot imagine a world where, if I look back on it, I would not have worked with Richie Havens, Randy Crawford, tons of people that I've worked with since, Steve Walsh.
Right.
I mean, all on that first album when I left, both people from Europe, from the States. If I look back over the whole of my history, I've just done an album, a new one, where I've got a guy from Azerbaijan, for instance, who's an incredible player of a thing called the tar, the TAR.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have done any of that if I'd stayed. What would have happened? I would have probably been a billionaire alcoholic, and what's the point? as opposed to still a working musician. That's how I'm a nomad.
Yeah.
I travel. That's what I do.
And you also traveled musically. I mean, you've done classical albums. You've done blues albums. What was the last thing you did there with A Life? What was it? A Life Within a Day?
With that's right. With Chris Squire.
Right.
we did some stuff together. So the Hackett album, yeah, I wouldn't have done any of that. It wouldn't have put me in touch there. And I don't think I would have written or played as hard, practiced as hard. I wouldn't have invested as much time in nylon guitar, for instance, and as much time in electric, because, when you're young and you have huge success, everyone's telling you you're marvelous. But privately, you're thinking, well, hey, we know that there's an awful lot of room for improvement. So, hopefully they remember you for something more than the cut of your clothes. And how you looked when you were in your 20s. For me, it was always about the dignity of a guy like Segovia, who could sit there in his 90s and still play the balls off the axe. Yeah. Now that was it.
Speaking of time, I see we're down to 4 minutes. So let me just.
I'm sorry about that.
No, it's fine. This is exactly. Listen, it's better that you talk than you say yes, no. So,
right.
The Genesis Extended World Tour is coming to my part of the world very soon. You've got a whole bunch of Quebec dates coming up, and Montreal is November 29th at Place des Arts. And at the beginning of the interview, you spoke about the French-Canadian connection with Genesis and tributes. Tell me a little bit about your connection with, Montreal, French Canadians.
Oh, right. Well, I first traveled there in 1957 as a child, and I was immediately struck by how extraordinary it was. Both Quebec and Montreal, and well, frankly, the whole of Canada just blew my tiny mind as a kid. But as an adult, it was the first area that really responded to us in. I keep talking about the pond. On that side of the pond, Genesis really struggled to fill places and to be understood, especially in places like the American South. Right. It really didn't happen until the last year I was with the band.
But right away in Quebec, though, But
right away, there's a tacit understanding, and that was tremendous. That was great for all sorts of reasons, and it told us that we could, if we stuck at it, make that happen everywhere else.
Yeah. And just quickly before we go, remind everybody to go to hackettsongs.com, and then quickly, one last word on the band with Steve Howe, GTR. It didn't last very long.
That's right. It didn't last long, but I had a great time working with Steve. We spent about 2 years putting together a band to make an album, and then we toured mainly on your side over there, and it was great fun while it lasted. But all things that are sold as supergroup have a pressure on them, and it meant that the novelty value of that isn't quite there by the time it comes to the idea of a second album. So my view is that it was two separate solo careers with some great talented new guys at the time, and I still look back with great fondness. I still love the song When There Aren't Rules of Mind, and I think it was a damn good song that we both came up with, and it fit the bill.
It was top 10, I believe, in the U.S. rock charts.
Well, I was amazed that we got so much success from it, and a gold album. So that was something tremendous.
Yeah, it absolutely was. Down to 40 seconds here. Genesis reunion, if you got the call, would you do it?
Probably not.
Okay. Fair enough.
To be honest.
Yeah, hey, it's fair enough. Steve, absolute pleasure. Love to do this again someday. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Brilliant.
There you have it, my interview with Steve Hackett. And, of course, don't forget his new album, Genesis Revisited, live at the Royal Albert Hall. And, of course, the Genesis Extended World Tour. Mitch, I certainly hope you enjoyed that.
Hey, it's always great to hear a guy who is still excessively passionate about playing music, the genre of music, and I think he's still looking to push corners. He's looking to explore the instrument and what it means to be a musician. And anytime you can connect with an artist like that, there's going to be sparks flying like you had.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of the stuff he said and some of the stuff he revealed was just fantastic. So thank you to Steve Hackett, and of course, thank you to Mitch Joel. And folks, remember, join us on Metal Raps, and of course, come back to One-on-One with Mitch Lafon weekly. And you can find me on iHeartRadio, Spreaker, Stitcher, TuneIn, iTunes, and of course, I throw eventually the audio up on YouTube. Thank you, folks. Thank you, Mitch.
Hey, man, thanks for having me.